Okay, so now we're going to be looking at our neuron model, and this is a model of a multipolar neuron, which would be a motor neuron. You'll see a three-dimensional figure here in the foreground, and you see a little bit of this background here where you've got a presynaptic neuron, a neuron that's sending its signal to this neuron. And over here, this would be a muscle fiber. So this neuron that we're going to be working with is sending the action potential to the muscle fiber. We're not really going to worry about that too much. We're really going to focus on the actual three-dimensional figure here, okay, the structure. So we'll start with the body of the neuron, also called the soma. So that would be this, of course, and you can see that it's got various organelles located in here. You don't need to worry about those because we covered, organelles way back at the beginning of the semester, so we're not really going to talk about that. We're going to concentrate on the parts of the neuron itself. So you see these projections coming into, we're going off of the body. You've got one here, you've got a couple here, you've got one here, okay, and some of them you can see down here. These are the dendrites. These represent the dendrites. Now remember, the dendrite carries the action potential into the body of the neuron. All right, so that action potential, which is probably coming from this presynaptic neuron here, is coming into the body. It's going to go across the body in what we call the graded potential. And I'm sure your lecture instructors will talk to you about that. And it's going to end up in this area right here where the body of the neuron begins to narrow. That area right here where that body is narrowing is called the axon hillock. In other words, it's basically where the axon, okay, which is the part of the neuron that carries the action potential away from the body, that's where that axon is beginning to form. So this narrowing area here is the axon hillock. Then you have the very first section of the axon, and that's called the initial segment, okay, just like the beginning segment, all right? This is where the very first voltage regulated gate opens when you make an action potential, basically, okay? And remember, once the first voltage gate opens, an action potential is what they call an all or nothing event. All right, so once that opens, that action potential is going to go down the entire neuron. Now, when we look at this here, in this structure right here, okay, what we're looking at is myelin that has been formed and is covering the axon. All right, if I take this off, you're going to see that in the center of all of this myelin is that axon right here, okay? And what this shows is that this orange is Schwann cells. And the Schwann cells, remember, make the myelin and they wrap it around the axon. So you can see here how it shows the different layers that have been wrapped around the axon, okay? So the orange represents the Schwann cell, okay? This light green yellowish represents the myelin, okay? If I put this back on, I want to point out the node of Ranvier, okay? So you have an area of myelin, then you have a gap in the myelin, you have another area of myelin, and you can see on the rest of this picture, you have these gaps. This gap is the node of Ranvier, okay? The node of Ranvier plays a significant role in how the action potential moves down the axon, all right? There's two ways an action potential can move down the axon. It can do what's called continuous propagation, which means every single gate that's on this axon has to open in order to move the electricity down. Or it can do what's called saltatory propagation, which means that the action potential can jump from gap to gap to gap to gap to gap, or node to node to node. And that is a much faster way for that action potential to move down that axon. Remember, axons can be extremely long. You can have a motor neuron axon that goes basically from your spinal cord to your big toe. It's a long ways, especially if you're tall. And so you want that action potential to move very quickly so that it can then innervate the muscle fibers that it's going to allow for the contraction of the muscle. So this gap is the node of Ranvier. Now, if I take this off again, okay, let's look at it this way. This gap right there is the node of Ranvier, okay? So if you have the model on an exam and you have tape tags on these different structures, you need to be able to identify those. So if it's pointed to that little gap, that's the node of Ranvier, okay? Now if I put this back on one more time, let me just talk about what this represents again. So each of these, I call them the hot dog buns because they kind of look like hot dog buns, okay? One of these would be a myelinated internode, right? Between the nodes, this is myelinated, and so it's referred to as a myelinated internode. So again, just really quickly, we've got dendrites, okay? We've got axon hillock. We've got the initial segment of the axon. We've got a myelinated internode. This guy. We've got Schwann cells that manufacture myelin, the orange. We've got a node of Ranvier right there. Okay. Now these guys right here, all right, which are also blue, are representing the telodendria and synaptic balls of a presynaptic neuron. A presynaptic neuron just means it's a neuron that is pre or before the synapse with this neuron, okay? If I had made the model, I would have made them in a different color, but I didn't make this model. I would have made them red or green or something so they looked different. But that's the synaptic bulb, and this would be the telodendria, okay, of the presynaptic neuron right there. Okay, and that's your neuron model.